Hello, and welcome to the next edition of Mrs. Mack Knows a Lot About That. Today we're doing Chapter 4, The Organization of Life, and we are on Section 3, The Diversity of Living Things. So what we're going to be talking about today are the 6 kingdoms that scientists use to classify all living things. So, there are 6 kingdoms. They're grouped based on the types of cells that they have, the food, how they get their food. So there are 6 kingdoms that we'll talk about. They are archaebacteria, eubacteria, fungi, protists, plants, and animals. So this chart is important. It gives you characteristics of each that we're going to talk about in the upcoming slides, and then examples of each. So the first one we're going to talk about are bacteria. Now, the bacteria are grouped into 2 different groups, archaebacteria and eubacteria. Most bacteria are eubacteria. The archaebacteria are, they can live in extreme conditions, like hot springs, so like places where other things wouldn't be able to live. And the eubacteria are the most common bacteria that we know about. But bacteria are small, they're single-celled. They usually have a cell wall, and they reproduce by cell division. You'll learn more about cell division in biology class, but the cell is the smallest unit of a living thing. So we're all made up of cells, billions and trillions and whatever number is bigger than that, cells, lots and lots of cells. Okay, so unlike a lot of organisms, bacteria do not have a nuclei in their cell. The nucleus is what contains the DNA. If you can see in this picture, in bacteria, there's no nucleus containing that DNA. It's just in the bacteria. Some kinds of bacteria can break down the remains and waste of other organisms. And when they do that, they break it down and they get the nutrients from those materials, and they can return those nutrients to the soil for other living things to use. Others can recycle nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen is important because it's one of the main components of proteins and genetic material. Deoxyribonucleic acid, that's DNA, that's our genetic material. And so it's important for us to make sure we can convert these nutrients and recycle them, because that's basically what it's all about. If you've ever seen The Lion King, The Circle of Life, everything gets reused and even after it dies. So bacteria can convert that nitrogen from the air into a form that the plants can use as part of their food source. Bacteria also allows a lot of organisms that include humans to get nutrients from their food. You've probably heard of the bacteria E. coli. It's found in the intestines of humans and some other animals, and it helps digest food and release vitamins that we need for our bodies. Now, if you have too much E. coli, it can make you very sick. But we all have a certain amount of E. coli in our bodies, and that helps us to break down our food and get the vitamins and the nutrients from the food that we need to use to grow. Fungi. A fungus is an organism. It doesn't have a nuclei, but it does have cell walls. Those cell walls are what allow that fungi to stand upright. Without the cell walls, then it would kind of flap over. It wouldn't be able to stand upright. Fungi does not have chlorophyll. That is what makes plants green, is the chlorophyll. And in the fall, when those leaves break down, and they start to turn colors, it's because that chlorophyll is being broken down. Chlorophyll is what makes them green. When the chlorophyll isn't the most common, then other colors are there. Since fungi doesn't have chlorophyll, you're not going to see green fungi. A mushroom is the reproductive structure of the fungus. The rest of the fungus is made up of these networks of fibers, and it's pretty extensive system, and it allows that fungi to absorb the food from the decaying organisms in the soil. So they can take those nutrients from something that's dying or dead and use it to grow. So fungi get their food by releasing chemicals that break down that organic matter. Organic is living. And then they absorb those nutrients. The fungi, the bodies of the fungi are these networks of threads, and they grow through the soil, through dead wood, through other material, and that's what they feed on. Bacteria play a really important role in breaking down dead organisms, but so does fungi. So both are important in breaking down those dead, decaying materials. Some fungi, like bacteria, can cause diseases. Athlete's foot is an example, and this picture is really disgusting, so I don't want to leave this slide up for too long. Other fungi can add flavor to food, like blue cheese. That fungus gives the cheese its blue color and the strong flavor of the cheese. Yeasts are also fungi, and that's what allows bread to rise. Yeast they produce a gas that makes the bread rise. Okay, enough of that picture. That picture is disgusting. Okay, then we have the next group, the next kingdom, which is the protists. These are very diverse organisms. They can be animal-like, like amoebas. They can be plant-like, such as kelp, and some are like fungi. Most of them are one-celled and they're microscopic, which means they can only be seen with a microscope. You cannot see them with the human eye. And you have something called diatoms, and these float on the ocean surface. Another protist is Plasmodium, and this is a one-celled organism, and it causes the disease malaria. Now, malaria is gone in developed parts of the world, but it still exists in some developing countries that are the poorer countries, the ones that don't have access to the clean water. And so this is protists. From an environmental standpoint, algae is the most important one. Algae is able to use energy from the sun to make its own food. So it's plant-like. And then the algae is the first source of food for all the other living things in the ocean and other bodies of water. So without the algae, life in the ocean and the lakes and ponds and stuff wouldn't exist. So algae is very, very important. Then we have plants. Plants are unique because they are able to make their own food. They use the sun's energy. I'm sure you've heard of photosynthesis before, and you probably know the equation because you learned that in middle school. But plants take in carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and they're able to use that to produce their own food, their glucose. And so then they can use that food to feed themselves, to grow, and then plants become that first source of food for all living animals on land. So plants are many-celled. They do have a cell wall that allows them to stand upright. If without a cell wall, they would fall over. And they absorb their nutrients from the soil using their root system. So the leaves, they take in water and the sunlight and the oxygen, and the roots take in other nutrients that they need to, and water as well, so that they can grow. And so these leaves and roots are connected by this vascular tissue, and they're like tubes that kind of carry that water and food throughout the plant. Now, the first plants that existed did not have this vascular tubing system. So they were not able to get their nutrients and pass it from root to leaves and pass it through the plant. They were, so they had to live in damp places, and they couldn't get very big because they didn't have these systems to transport the nutrients. Their descendants are still alive. They're called mosses. If you've ever seen moss, you know it grows very close to a surface, and normally that surface is very damp. Ferns and club mosses were the first vascular plants, and they varied in size. Some of the ferns can be very big, some can be very small, but these are the organization of lower plants. Then we have gymnosperms. These are woody vascular seed plants, and their seeds are not enclosed by an ovary or a fruit. So if you look in this example, this pine tree, the pine tree is gymnosperms, and they have cones, and those cones contain the genetic part that they're going to try to pass on and make new plants. Most of the lumber and paper that we use comes from gymnosperms, so they're pretty important plants for us. They have a lot of adaptations that help them live in drier conditions. So whereas the lower plants, the ferns and the mosses, they need to be near a water source, gymnosperms don't necessarily need to because they've been able to adapt over time. They can produce pollen, which protects and moves the sperm between the plants. So a lot of times animals or the wind can spread their pollen to help create new plants. These plants also produce seeds, which protect developing plants from drying out. So the seeds help the plant from drying out. A conifer's needle-like leaves also lose little water, so the water doesn't escape through the leaves like it does in some of the other plants. Most of the Christmas trees that if you buy a live Christmas tree, they're going to be gymnosperms. We have angiosperms. These are flowering plants. They produce seeds within fruit. So the fruit protects the seeds, and the seeds are what need to go on to make new plants. Most land plants are angiosperms. The flower is the reproductive structure of the plant. You will see sometimes even grasses have little small flowers, and they use the wind to make their pollen go to other places and so they can reproduce. Others have large flowers that attract birds and insects, and then they use these birds and insects to carry their seeds and carry their pollen so that they can pollinate. Like for example, birds might eat the seeds, but then the seeds might come out in the other end, and then they can go into the soil and plant and grow new plants. Most land animals are dependent on flowering plants. Most of the food we eat comes from these flowering plants, like wheat, rice, beans, fruit, lettuce. Okay. It also gives us the building materials and fibers that we need, like oak and cotton. Those all come from flowering plants as well. Now animals, last group we'll talk about. They cannot make their own food. They have to get it from the environment. They have no cell wall, so their bodies are more flexible than plants. Some animals have evolved hard exoskeletons that protect them, like beetles. And as a result of not having cell walls, animals are more mobile than plants. They can move around their environment, at least at some point in their lives, they can move around. You have invertebrates, which have no backbone. These mostly live attached to a hard surface in the ocean, and they filter their food out of the water, such as coral or worms and mollusks. These organisms are only mobile when they are larvae, so when they're in their larva stage. At this early stage, they are part of what is called the ocean's plankton. That's the first source of food for most animals in the ocean. Other invertebrates like squid, insects, they can actively move and search for food. More insects exist on Earth than any other type of animal. They outnumber everything. They're successful because they have a waterproof skeleton. They can move and reproduce quickly. They can fly, and they can live on little food and hide from their enemies. Many insects and plants have evolved together, and they depend on each other to survive. You might want to pause this slide and get your notes because I'm going to move on. I have to cover a lot of times humans and insects are enemies because they eat our crops and okay, and then here's vertebrates. You'll need to pause this slide and get your notes because I'm running out of time. Vertebrates have a backbone. They can be warm-blooded.